Hanukkah came right on time this year. I'm glad you laughed, because some of us like to joke about how the Jewish holidays are always too early or too late, knowing that they always fall on the same days of the Jewish calendar, even though they move around the secular calendar a bit. But no matter whether Hanukkah occurs during Thanksgiving or during Christmas, it always coincides with the Torah portions at the end of Genesis that tell the story of Joseph. This week we read Miketz, which begins with Joseph in prison for a crime he didn't commit, and ends with him as Pharaoh's second in command. I don't think it's a coincidence that we observe Hanukkah, the holiday that celebrates the triumph of the weak over the strong and the few over the many, while we read about Joseph, the younger brother who ascends from the literal depths of the pit to the heights of royalty. And it's also no coincidence that both the story of Hanukkah and the story of Joseph are more complicated than they first appear. The heroes of our stories are, quite simply, not always so heroic. Take Joseph, for example. He is the insightful prophet, able to correctly interpret Pharaoh's dreams and earned his trust. He's a problem solver, advising Pharaoh on how to prepare for the upcoming famine. And he's also just a little bit cruel. When his brothers come begging for food, they don't recognize Joseph in his Egyptian finery, but he recognizes them. And he takes the opportunity to toy with them, demanding that they bring their younger brother Benjamin to him, knowing full well how devastated their father Jacob will be. Later, he places his silver cup in Benjamin's bag so that he can accuse him of stealing it and threaten to keep Benjamin as his slave. We can all understand Joseph's desire for revenge. After all, his brothers did sell him into slavery. But Joseph taking advantage of his power over his brothers by frightening and dominating them is still, shall we say, morally questionable. Likewise, the Maccabees, the brave fighters who drove out the mighty Syrian Greek army to reclaim their land and their temple, were not purely heroic. The books of Maccabees portray Matthias and his sons as religious zealots who fight against not only the Syrian Greeks, but also against their fellow Jews, the Hellenized Jews who don't mind assimilating with Greek culture. The Maccabees kill those Jews who don't agree with them in the name of defending their faith. And when the Maccabees, also known as the Hasmoneans, take power in Israel, their dynasty is marked by corruption, oppression, and violence. While we may tell our children just the heroic side of our stories, Jewish tradition teaches that acknowledging the bad along with the good isn't just acceptable, it's imperative. We learn more from our stories when we can ask difficult questions and call out the ways in which our ancestors fell short. Even the sages of the Talmud, who had much more reverence for the characters in the Torah than we do today, had no problem pointing out Joseph's flaws. Why did Joseph die before his brothers? Asks Rabbi Kama. Because he conducted himself with an air of superiority. The rabbis of the Talmud also downplay the heroism of the Maccabees, barely mentioning them when they recount the story of Hanukkah, but highlighting the corruption of the Hasmonean kings once they're in power. Acknowledging and standing up against injustice and immorality when it is being perpetrated by our enemies, but also when it is perpetrated by our friends or even by members of our own community, as our moral duty as human beings and as Jews. I bring this up because it seems that when it comes to certain issues, like the war in Gaza or the related rise in anti-Semitism around the globe, there are those who want us to believe that there are only two sides, us versus them, good versus evil, and that any questioning or challenging of our side is seen as betrayal. In this black and white world, you're either pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian. You're either pro-free speech or pro-censorship. And once you choose a side, you must defend it at all costs. So for some progressives who support Palestinian self-determination and oppose the occupation, even an expression of support or compassion for Israelis is rejected. And for some staunch Zionists, any questioning of Israel's current military campaign is akin to supporting Hamas. Similarly, if you support the notion of free speech on college campuses, you might find yourself somehow reluctant to say that students ought not publicly call for the genocide of Jews. It is a strange world we live in. Many of us noted that when revelations of Hamas's use of sexual violence against Israeli women were brought to light, there was a muted, or at least delayed, response from prominent women's and human rights organizations. As Jill Filipovich writes about sexual violence in wartime, it is routinely denied or downplayed by those accused of committing it, as well as by their governments and supporters, who are sure that their guys are always the good ones. Some of those who deny or question allegations of October 7th sexual abuse argue not only that those abuses may not have happened, but also that giving credence to these claims is, in effect, justifying Israel's war in Gaza. In other words, for these black and white thinkers, Israel is the colonizing aggressor and Palestine is the oppressed victim, and we can't acknowledge any facts that might lessen the Palestinians' righteousness in this situation. On the other hand, there are those who see criticism of Israel's military campaign as tantamount to supporting Hamas. So Rabbi Josh Weinberg, the executive director of ARTSA, wrote this week, "On Tuesday, the UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to demand a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, a pronounced demonstration of global support for ending the Israel-Hamas war. Put another way," he continues, "the UN held an emergency meeting to remind terrorists everywhere that there are few consequences for massacring, raping, and abducting civilians." However you feel about the rightness or wrongness of a ceasefire, I think characterizing support for a ceasefire as a message to terrorists to keep terrorizing is at the very least unfair. It's also unhelpful, as it contributes to the black and white, all or nothing thinking too many of us are engaged in. Judaism has long been a proponent of a yes-and approach to seeing the world. In the Talmud, God famously declares that two rival houses of sages, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, are both right, announcing, "Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim." These and these are the words of the living God. This moment calls on us to embrace the Elu ve'elu. Israeli suffering is real. Palestinian suffering is real. Free speech is important. Protecting students from harassment and intimidation is important. Joseph was both wise and cruel. The Maccabees were both brave fighters and religious zealots. Ignoring inconvenient truths doesn't get us anywhere. In the words of the prophet Zechariah, "These are the things you are to do. Speak the truth to one another. Render true and perfect justice in your gates." Only when we speak truth will we be able to bring justice to our world. Shabbat shalom.